Hi, and welcome to video 6 of Module 1, Identifying Bias. In this video, we're going to examine 6 different ways that a study could be not so great, could result in some data that is not super valuable. Okay, so if we're going to talk about different kinds of bias, we should probably know what that means, right? So a study that is conducted by a procedure that produces the correct result on average is said to be unbiased. It is biased if it over or underestimates the true value on average. So what that means is if you do a study many times and generally it produces correct results, then it's an unbiased study. However, if you conduct the study many times and it results in things that are off the charts, they're way too big, or that it underestimates values or it overestimates values, then that is a biased study. In this video, we're going to examine 6 of the most common types of bias, but there are many other ways that studies could have a bias in them. Also, we're going to tend to focus on one bias at a time, but in reality, many times you can have more than one bias present at once. In this video, we're going to talk about what to look for in order to identify biases that may be present, and things that we might be able to do to prevent having those kinds of biases in our own studies. The first kind of bias that we're going to talk about is called leading response bias. And this happens when the phrase that you use on the survey suggests a particular kind of response. I always think of like Law and Order dramas when I think about leading response bias, where you might have a lawyer that says, "I object, he's leading the witness." And then the judge is like, "Overruled." So in this case, the lawyer might be asking the witness questions to try and elicit a particular response, which the other lawyer is recognizing and says, hey, those are not fair questions. You can't phrase it that way. So let's look at an example of how this might happen on a survey. Maybe you have a question that says, how fast was the car going when it smashed into the tree? Now, on this particular question, there are 2 very strong words. The first one is fast because it's conveying a high speed of the vehicle. And the second word is smashed because it's implying really violent, aggressive behavior of the vehicle smashing into the tree. So a better way to ask this question to get this kind of information might be something like, what would you estimate the speed of the vehicle when the accident occurred? In that case, your language is much more neutral and you're more likely to get a less biased response. A second and more subtle example of a leading response bias: would you vote for a woman for president if she was qualified in every other way? Now, I say this one is more subtle because I wouldn't necessarily think this is biased looking at it, because it sounds like they're asking, hey, if a woman is qualified, you gonna vote for her? However, this last phrase here, every other way, that other word is implying that being a woman is a disqualification for president. By using that word other, you're implying that womanhood is not a qualification for president, is actually a strike against her. So if you are trying to identify a bias in a study and it's talking about language, it's giving you examples of questions that were on the survey, chances are leading response bias is the bias that is present. A second way that a study might be biased is if there is undercoverage. Undercoverage happens when some members of the population are not appropriately represented in the sample. So a couple videos ago, we talked about lots of different ways of finding a sample, and that some samples were better than others because some samples have a better representation of the population than others. So here's an example of undercoverage. Sigmund Freud based his theories of human psychology off of himself, one child, and his patients. And his patients were mostly middle-aged women from Vienna. Now, Sigmund Freud is known as the father of modern psychology, and he's extremely important to the field of psychology because he's the one who really kind of formalized and got other folks interested in formalizing the study of the human psyche. However, he tried to make claims about all human beings based off of himself, one kid, and middle-aged women from Vienna. So I can think off of the top of my head easily like a dozen different people that this would not describe, myself among them, right? So the people that Freud studied were from a very particular culture and age group, and that's going to change the result of the study. I mean, the only adult male that he used was himself, and really that's going to create a bias. So there were people in the human population that were not adequately represented in Freud's study, and that's resulting in an undercoverage. A third type of bias is called self-interest bias. And this happens when whomever's conducting the study has a vested interest in the outcome and the results of the study. For example, maybe you are paid to find a particular result, or maybe you are a company studying yourself and you're like, yeah, we studied our product and it's great. Sure it is. Do you have any independent reviews? So an example of where this is happening currently is with Andrew Wakefield. He was this British scientist who was paid over £400,000 to find a link between the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and autism. And all of the studies that have been done after Wakefield studies have found absolutely no link between the vaccine and autism. Any studies that find a link between vaccines and autism are all traced back to Wakefield. They all cite Wakefield's study. And he was paid to specifically find this correlation. And in fact, the journals that published Wakefield's results have all unpublished them. They've all taken them back and said, actually, no, when we try to replicate them, we cannot replicate his results. The New York Times has even commented on this by saying that Andrew Wakefield has become one of the most reviled doctors of his generation, blamed directly and indirectly, depending on the accuser, for irresponsibly starting a panic with tragic repercussions. Vaccination rates so low that childhood diseases once all but eradicated here, whooping cough and measles among them, have re-emerged, endangering young lives. Because of Wakefield's study, folks are not vaccinating their children, which means that diseases that were once completely gone, out of the country, no one got them. I mean, years and years ago, people died from these diseases, and now we got rid of them. They're coming back because of his biased study. Another type of bias that's really difficult to get around is called social acceptability bias. And this happens when you're studying taboo topics where you don't really want to be honest about. So for example, in my class, what I often do here is I'll say, raise your hand if you on a regular basis pick your nose and consume what you find there. You eat it. Yeah. If you're in a room of 30 peers, you are not very likely to raise your hand there. In fact, only maybe one time in a class have I had somebody raise their hand and admit to this. And because it's got a stigma attached to it. It's gross, it's icky, right? You don't want to do that. So it becomes difficult to study things that have a social acceptability bias working against them. Here's another example. Suppose you're doing a government survey and it asks, have you ever cheated on your taxes? So the government is asking if you've cheated on them, and you're probably not very likely to be super honest on that survey. Some folks will be, but most would not be. A bias that is present in a lot of our alumni surveys at the college is non-response bias. And this happens when not enough people complete the study. So maybe you send a survey out to 1,000 people and you only get a handful of them back. You don't get a lot, you don't hear from a lot of people because they just don't reply to the survey. So for example, we sent a survey out to 100 MVCC students, and 83% of the half dozen surveys returned indicate that students really love the campus food. It's great. Yeah, 83% of people who returned a survey say the food is awesome. And if I survey 100 students, obviously that's 83, right? But only half a dozen people, 6 people, returned a survey. You think that 6 people out of 100 is a very good response rate? Yeah, nope. So this is very difficult when you send out a survey and you're trying to get the information, but people don't reply. And the last type of bias we're going to discuss in this video is a voluntary response bias. And this happens when you take a voluntary response sample. And we talked about this earlier, but remember that when you take a voluntary response sample, the people who are most likely to complete the survey are those who have stronger responses and more often than not, negative responses. Okay, so just a couple of notes about the different types of biases that we have examined. First, Even if you have a large sample size, that cannot make up for a bias. If you survey 100,000 people, but you used a leading question on 100,000 surveys, you're still going to have leading response bias. If 100,000 people volunteer to answer a survey, you're still going to have voluntary response bias. So just because there's a lot of people surveyed doesn't mean that bias can't be present. Also, as I mentioned before, it's possible for more than one bias to be present in a study. The way that this is typically resolved in a class is we'll ask you, what is the bias most strongly exhibited? But in the real world, there may be overlapping biases. And lastly, voluntary response bias and non-response bias are really easily confused because they're very similar. They both have people responding to a survey seemingly voluntarily, except that's not quite true. In a voluntary response bias, people choose to respond. That was the kind of sample that was taken. In a non-response bias, people don't really have a choice to respond. They are told to respond and they choose not to. So the main thing that I use to identify the difference between these two, if I'm trying to identify is it voluntary response, is it non-response, is it a voluntary response sample? Are people choosing to answer the survey? If so, it's a voluntary response bias. If not, if it's just saying a survey was sent out but they didn't get many back, that is a non-response bias. Okay, so we're going to look at 4 different studies, and I'd like you to identify the bias that is most strongly exhibited in each of those 4 studies. So as we've done in a few videos before, we'll read through each of the examples, and you can pause the video, take a moment to jot some thoughts down, maybe circle or identify the features of the study that cause you to label it as a particular kind of bias, and then we will go through the 4 together. So get your pencil ready, and here we go. Or pen, you can use pen. Example A. The Literary Digest was a magazine in the early 20th century that, prior to 1936, had always correctly predicted the winner of the US presidential election. For the 1936 election, which happened during the Great Depression, the magazine surveyed registered automobile owners, telephone users, and those subscribed to their magazine. Their results indicated that Alfred Landon would overwhelmingly defeat FDR. Obviously, FDR won and became president. This mistake so discredited the magazine that it went out of business, and the techniques used for polling public opinions soon changed thereafter. What type of bias is most strongly exhibited in this description? Feel free to pause the video if you need some time to reread some of the details. Example B is a follow-up to Example A. In 1976 and 1988, researchers found an additional and even more significant source of bias in the Literary Digest example. The magazine had mailed out 10 million surveys to collect their data, but less than 25% of the surveys were returned to the magazine. What type of bias is exhibited here? Example C. A high school principal interviews a simple random sample of 100 students to ask them about their use of illegal drugs. Just 5% of the students admitted to possessing or using illegal drugs. What kind of bias is evident in this study? Example D. The school newspaper conducts a study about the food on campus and publishes the following blurb about their results. 100% of students like campus food! We asked you guys, how do you feel about the food in the dining hall? And here is what you said. 24% responded, OMG, it's totally the best. 36% responded, it is so good. And 40% responded, it's not that bad. What type of bias is exhibited in this study? Okay, so let's go over the results of these 4 examples. In Example A, the Literary Digest surveyed people who owned a registered automobile, had a telephone, and were subscribed to their magazine to see who they would vote for in the election. Now, this was during the Great Depression, so only people with extra money would fit into that group of people. So most people were left out of the survey. Because of this, there was undercoverage happening. As surprising as it may sound, though, undercoverage was not the greatest source of bias in this study. because only 25% of the surveys were returned, that is a very small portion of the survey sent out, there was a non-response bias in the study as well. And those studies in the 70s and 80s indicated that the non-response bias was the greater reason for the inaccurate result than the undercoverage was. In example C, a principal was asking students, hey, do you do illegal drugs? And of course people said no. So students are not likely to admit using illegal drugs to their principal because that's not such a great thing to be doing or admitting to doing. So this is a social acceptability bias. The taboo prevented folks from responding honestly. And in the last example, example D, we had that fabulously worded survey by the school newspaper, right? I think all of the options had positive connotations to them. So this was a leading response bias. The phrase that was used on the survey, it should have just said good, neutral, bad, right? Just those kinds of options. Instead, it was so good and totes fabulous, yo. That wasn't quite it, but you know, that kind of phrase. So that study had quite a bit of leading response bias to it. You could argue that there might have also been a little bit of self-interest bias there if the newspaper was sponsored by the dining hall. However, in this case, we aren't aware of that information. We don't know if that's true or not, although that would be something that I would investigate if I were to examine the study further. This concludes our video on different kinds of biases, and in fact, it concludes all of Module 1. Module 2 is going to discuss displaying data. So now that we've talked about different ways of classifying data, collecting data, and preventing bias with our data, in the next module, we're going to examine how do I display that data? How do I make sense of it and show it off? So if you'd like to start Module 2, you can click on the arrow to the right where you'll learn about frequency distributions for data that isn't grouped. If you want to go back and review the different types of studies, you can click on the arrow to the left. Thanks for watching and have a fabulous day!